Welcome to the Cycle World podcast. I'm Mark Hoyer, I'm the editor-in-chief, and I'm with Kevin Cameron, our technical editor. This episode is a special episode related to Barber Vintage Festival, Kenny Roberts, perhaps one of the largest celebrations of motorcycling and culture at a racetrack in America. I think we were something on the order of 80,000 fans at Barber taking in ARMA vintage races, which I participated in, and then a host of events at the museum, the Barber Vintage Museum, or just the Barber Museum. Kevin was a noted speaker. We had a fundraising dinner. And as I said, Kenny Roberts was there, Kenny Roberts Jr. We saw David Aldana. We saw Scott Russell. And star after star, Jason Uribe was racing. Hayden Gillum was racing on this spectacular racetrack in what I would call a garden-like setting. You know, Road America is one of my favorite tracks, and I would call that a park-like setting. It's very they call it the National Park of Speed, and it's a little more rustic. It's, I think, equally as beautiful or differently as beautiful. And Barber is just incredibly well groomed. Just 500 spots rented for the swap meet. It was madness. What's your take? Where were you, Kevin?
Well, I found myself in the museum most of the time, but I did get out to the paddock and met a lot of racers, not people I'd known before, but people whose culture was recognizable as that which had so attracted me in the late 1960s and 1970s, because it is a good-natured and cooperative culture. It is not combative and self-centered. It's very comfortable.
Yeah.
If you need a stator or a coil for your old TZ ignition, somebody's sure to have one and will lend it to you.
If you need an entire spare motorcycle because the valve seat fell out of your racing BMW, a fellow I was pitted with next to, Paul Elledge, his BMW dropped a valve seat, and he was in contention for the title.
Oh,
and needed to race, and a fellow lent him his 650. He stood aside, knowing that Paul could win his championship. I totally agree. So ARMA Racing, American Historic Racing Motorcycle Association, ARMA paddock, incredibly supportive. I dropped in as an interloper at the last race of the season on a waiver to be able to race. At 0 points, so I was starting at the back of the grid and so forth. But what a paddock! Everybody was spectacularly cool, and I really appreciate every fan of the podcast. For example, just people near constantly coming up and saying that they were really enjoying the work here. So we appreciate that quite a bit. But as you say, a very supportive paddock. Everybody's there to race and be competitive, have a good time, but we also know we have day jobs, and we're not viciously trying to eliminate each other from the racetrack. It was great. It was really great.
The scheduled appearance of Kenny Roberts on the Yamaha 0W48, on which he won the 1980 World 500 Championship, that all took place. And Kenny, I could see him practicing flinging a leg over the bike before he went out, but he was scheduled to do a couple of laps and then sign all the RZ 350s, yellow ones that were waiting in the autograph area. But he started that bike and went off onto the racetrack, making the glorious sound of the two-stroke era. And everything went according to plan. It was wonderful because, of course, so many things in racing do not. So it's
It was,
nice when it comes off.
yeah, it was beautiful. It was, what a moment, midday, and those sounds, him putting his knee down around the racetrack, and he was not loafing around. I mean, I don't think he was on lap record pace, but he was not loafing around. He was riding as a Kenny Roberts would ride,
Yes.
and it was just the cloud of smoke and that sound of it going up the front straightaway. That's where I was standing with you, in fact. And then there goes Kenny in his leathers, and then the autograph signing afterward was amazing. I
Yes.
stood in line. I have I don't have the shirt on, but I have Kenny Roberts Jr., David Aldana, and Scott Russell on my Cycle World T-shirt I had at the event. So it was a opportunity for me to go full fanboy on folks I've admired for a long time.
Full fanboy.
But
Yes.
it was a huge long line. People had pieces of bodywork, and they were signing postcards and all kinds of things like that. So it was a really a wonderful celebration of culture of motorcycle culture. BMW does their Motorrad Days Americas, which is sort of their brand celebration. This is the event that they choose to do that with, and they had a huge booth full of new motorcycles. There's demo rides. So it's not just vintage bikes and all that celebration, but it's also a great big place to see all kinds of new bikes. And then, man, if you want to blow some money, head over to the swap meet. Every conceivable thing that you might want for virtually any motorcycle that's ever existed is there in some form or another. Often rusty, often mangled, but there.
Got a rear cylinder for my Curtis?
Yeah, it's entirely possible.
Sure it is. Kenny was his own laconic self. I had the opportunity to speak with him in front of a group of interested persons, and Kenny is not the easiest interview. There's not a lot of flywheel mass, which means you have to keep pushing, keep the conversation going. And I could see that people were smiling and attentive and were enjoying this because it is from the mouth of the king, the man who was there. And at the end, when he was asked by an MC or whatever if he had anything further to say, he said, "I'm done."
That's pretty. That's
And of
great.
course, that makes you remember Nicky Lauda, who was strictly required to be signing autographs for a specified number of minutes. And when that last second ticked away, he was on his way to his airplane and home.
Yeah, I have to say,
Because, as Valentino Rossi once said, they will take your life if you let them.
I have to give Kenny credit for hanging tough for the autograph signing. He was not done. He finished the line.
Yeah, I could see it went on, and he was just right there penciling away.
Yep.
It was good.
It was very cool. So you had some time, you kind of know the backstory of getting that bike together that he rode, his championship winning bike.
Well, Chuck Honeycutt, who is a long-time racer and has ridden many kinds of motorcycles, became the restoration director at the museum. And I think he's emeritus now, or has some sort of adjusted status there. But I got a call from him some weeks ago saying, "Look, we've got to do this, and I have some questions here." So I had the opportunity to talk with Chuck while this whole process was going on, and the bike wasn't running well. It wasn't starting well. It wasn't looking like being a success. And so one of the first things he did to eliminate that as a question was to put a set of TZ250 carburetors on there, VM34s with 6 F9 needles 0 needle jets, 65 pilots, and 3.0 slides.
Have you
And
done this
it
before?
ran, it ran better, but not really well. So Chuck got into the ignition components and he checked the things and made some replacements. Of course, a museum has not only the bikes on display, but vast resources stored away from the public eye. So changes to the ignition perked it up more. So it was starting better. It still wasn't right. It just seemed something was missing. So he decides to make a compression test. Just the most basic. This is not leak down. This is just screwing that thing into the spark plug hole and pulling the back wheel through until the needle stops moving. 60 psi.
Well, what should it be? That seems on the low side.
That's slow. All right. When way back in 1971, I think those H1Rs were running about 140 psi, tested that way.
Yeah.
So Chuck went off and considered the problem of piston rings. And at one point he said to me, Brian, it's Brian Case, the CEO of the museum. He doesn't much like people messing with stuff around here, And I said, why does he have to know? So,
sorry, folks. Shh, don't tell Brian.
Right. So, delving into an untouched spares kit, he took out 4 new rings. Racing two-strokes usually have just one compression ring. Of course, being two-stroke, they don't have an oil scraper ring, and they don't have a second ring because the balance between longevity of seal and friction loss favors one piston ring.
Yeah.
So that really got it going, but then it quit. So Brian appears and he's poking around, and the bike is on the stand and he's turning the engine slowly with the rear wheel. And Brian says, the ignition rotor isn't turning. So, well, all right, that's something different. We can fix that. So they get busy and they fix that, make sure that it's timed properly and so forth. And now the bike runs well, starts well. They're beginning to have real confidence that this thing is going to be good. And so it was.
Well, a DNF for King Kenny on his parade laps or his demonstration laps that wouldn't do, right? You can't
not at all. And of course, the whole premise of this relationship between Kenny and the museum is that Kenny's personal collection of race bikes is on some basis transferred to the museum. It's a process that's taken 3 years.
Memorabilia, all trophies, all kinds
all
of
that stuff. Yeah, all that wonderful stuff. And of course, I can just hear my own wife saying, do we really need to keep all these things here? It's taking up quite a lot of space. Yes, dear. I'll get right on it. Anyway.
Yep, same. Like,
yeah.
What do I do with all this if something happens? I'm not sure. Well, I'll make a list.
Make a list.
Provide directions.
Form an advisory committee.
Yes.
File a report. Anyway, that process has taken place, and we can look forward to a future of presumably periodic appearances by Kenny on one or another of those historic motorcycles. And it was they started it up in the restoration area downstairs in the basement. Take that gigantic elevator with 25,000 pounds capacity down to the basement floor. They started it up there, and to me it just sounded normal. Yeah, that's what you hear at the races.
Yeah.
And of course, the last notes of two-stroke exhaust have long since left the air, and so that was of interest. And also, they started up. I think was that a V5? I think they started up Kenny's four-stroke GP bike that his race team and many experienced advisors had designed for the 2002 beginning of MotoGP. So that was all grand, and it was grand to go into the actual work area, which is also a way to bypass the lunch checkpoint, and see the bike sitting there and the original carburetors in a bin. Beautiful zero cutaway, meaning that the slide closes the air passage completely at the front. In the back of the slide is a rectangular opening. So this was Mikuni's answer to the responsiveness of Electron carburetors, which had no idle system. And there they were, their bell mouths made out of magnesium, their float bowls made out of magnesium. And
Wow.
it's hard to imagine that this is 44 years ago, that this material was hot and up to date. But time passes that way. I have looked at photographs of Formula One engine pistons, and 40 years ago, they didn't look anything like the present day pistons that we expect to see in something like a 450 motocrosser, which are very short skirted. They basically consist of a flat disc to hold the piston rings, two little mini skirts hanging down, not for modesty, but to prevent the disc from tipping sideways in the bore, and wrist pin bosses connected to the piston crown by a crisscross of stiffening beams. So, yes, there's been a lot of change in 44 years, but it was great to see the 0W48, which that was the year that I think that they introduced aluminum as a chassis material. Motocross had, during the 1970s, built bikes with aluminum swing arms, and they, in general, when it comes to chassis stuff, motocross is the most prolific source of new technology. But I asked Ken Clark, the late Ken Clark, who was long the head of Yamaha US racing, what the chassis material was that they used in the first aluminum bikes. And ultimately, he informed me that it was Z5D, an alloy originally developed for welded aluminum rail cars. And the thing about this is an age hardening alloy. If you make something out of 6061, which is the usual weldable alloy here in the US system, it then has to be heat treated after welding in order to realize its properties. But Z5D, you weld it, you wait 2 weeks for it to self-harden, and all the strength you want appears over that period of time, but you have to wait.
I'll have to make notes for my custom chassis, Z5D.
How long has it been?
Yeah. I don't know if I can heat treat at home, can I? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, Kenny said that the early aluminum chassis just were so weak that they were unstable. and they kept making the wall thickness greater. And mind you, this is square aluminum tubing, roughly an inch or an inch and an eighth on the side. And very quickly, that form of construction was abandoned in favor of the two large aluminum side beams, which are of a much larger section than the square tubing. And in this way, they were able to make stiffer chassis that were lighter. And here's how that works. Imagine that you have a steel tube chassis, and you say to yourself, this thing is pretty heavy. I'm going to make one out of 20 gauge tubing. So you do that and you find, oh, well, look, the engine mounts are cracking. I'll put a little reinforcement there and we'll weld the mounts onto that reinforced or buttered area, as they call it. Well, that's better. But now we've lost our weight savings because we've had to add reinforcement at every point we want to feed stress into the thinner metal. And eventually you get so thin that, like a plastic drink cup, you can push the side of it in with your thumb. Well, if you make that same thing out of aluminum, it's going to be 3 times as thick because aluminum weighs roughly 1/3 what steel does. So the wall thickness prevents that buckling. And it is also more competent at feeding stress into the structure as a whole. So the idea of making lighter and lighter steel tube chassis came to an end because there was nowhere for it to go. We got down to an inch or an inch and an eighth, and 16 gauge or a little thicker than that. And that's all she wrote. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't build a lightweight steel chassis that worked well. It has been done and it is being done. But this is why aluminum was adopted in the first place.
It recalls
this bike was a pioneer in that technological change.
It recalls a conversation I had with a mountain bike component designer, and he said, "Well, you know, we make aluminum handlebars, tapered aluminum handlebars for mountain bikes, and it requires X grams of metal. It just does. You know, they basically had gotten to the most optimal wall thickness that would stand up to the stress, and you could make them stronger if you needed to for somebody like me who's 225 pounds and hammering, bending his seat post as he did twice on his mountain bike. So, it just takes a certain amount of material."
Yeah. That's how it goes. But it's great to be at Barber for this weekend because they bring out their shuttles, which are trailers with overhead shade, and open seating that are pulled by pickup trucks with unfashionably large engines. And you get from place to place economically and swiftly that way. There'll be another shuttle along in a few minutes, and you just wait until you get to where you want to go, and there you are.
The design of the track with that ring road, and then everything is in orbit around the racetrack.
Yeah,
is just it was ultra convenient and easy to get around, and all God, the massive camping, the show itself, obviously the museum, if the museum isn't the biggest motorcycle museum in the world, I'd be shocked.
Yeah.
But overwhelmingly beautiful and overwhelmingly stacked with interesting things. And then as you say, there's the entire world where all of those running motorcycles, like, pull it off the shelf and do a little prep and it'll start. You know, they're all meant to run, every one of those darn things. There's that whole work area where all that magical stuff happens, and all those spare parts and the people working on them. You know, Brian Slark was at the museum for years and years. He used to be
He never looks any older.
The Norton guy. He was the Norton guy in Southern
Yeah.
California. I had a very nice, fairly original, extremely original Norton Commando that he used to work on for the second owner, John Leisner, who is the father of my cohort over here, Andy, when he was the publisher, and I bought it from him, got it running, and Brian's like, "Oh yeah, I worked on that bike." But Brian was a wealth of knowledge, just for virtually anything vintage. He did all the, he restored a bunch of the BMWs that we had talked about in relation to what I was working on this weekend, which was riding a Formula 750 and Bears 1972 R75/5, built in the spirit of the Butler and Smith Superbike. So essentially a Superbike replica of the era with the frame braces, the same frame braces that Butler and Smith had, because it was a twin loop, sort of Norton Manx like.
Udo Giedel struts.
Yeah, the struts. And it was essentially kind of twin sparring this. It was trying to connect the steering head to the swing arm pivot.
Sure.
There was a bunch of bracing under the swing arm to stiffen that up. And then the rear wheel was laced offset so we could fit, wider rubber on it. And this was an existing bike that was developed. It was originally built from junkyard parts by a guy named Ivan Messina, and then Dan May, the executive director of ARMA, bought it from Ivan and continued development. And it's making about 70 to 75 horsepower, depending on the dyno, with a beautiful torque curve. And what you were talking about, zero cutaway VMs, this bike has, I think they're VM 36s.
Yeah.
And the slides, round slides are what you have to use in ARMA. Round slides, you can use a CR or a VM, according to the rule book that I read. These are VMs, and everybody has VM parts. And that's one of the reasons it's like, hey, if you need jetting or whatever, it's all over the paddock. Everybody's like, salt shakers full of brass,
Yes.
And but the slides were packed and flowed with a putty.
Yeah.
And so it would 8-stroke at 3,000 RPM. So it was rich down low. But when we ran that thing on the dyno, two things: on the racetrack and running it on the dyno. Running in the dyno wide open throttle with the sniffer in the pipe, a straight line from the O2 sensor.
Yeah.
Just perfect jetting it wide.
Constant mixture. Yeah.
Great constant mixture. And it played out on the racetrack. The throttle response in the power band, which was beautifully wide, it was about 4,800 RPM to 82. You just turned it on. You wanted more. You just kept rolling it, and it pulled. Grab a gear. It was really, really nice to ride. Anyway, Butler and Smith replica, racing it in ARMA, in Bears and Formula 750, beautiful silver paint job. And I got to ride that over the weekend. Never saw Barber. Had never really ridden the bike in anger. We had a test in Chicago that was just pouring with rain. And so I basically, once it stopped raining, I got to wobble around on a very slick, wet racetrack. I got at least familiar with how the power was and how the shifting was, and then got to race. I won 2 races, the 2 Bears races, and I got 5th and 6th in the 2 days of racing in Formula 750. So super good time, super fun. Great race in Bears on Saturday with a guy on a BMW, Justin Hebel, and then this other fellow on a 650 Triton, so a Triumph motor and a featherbed frame, 650 with a single with a drum brake, and he was flying. David Tompkins was his name, and it was it was really fun. I got past. They pushed me to my fastest lap of the weekend because I didn't want to get past again. I didn't want the trouble of trying to get it back. So I just rode as hard as I could for one spectacular lap. And
one of the great things about vintage racing is that a lot of available technology that we can use today was not available when these bikes were built. So applying what you know about engine tuning or engine development can just make you feel like a wizard. Because
Yeah.
It's so easy to. It's not necessarily cheap, but it's easy to apply modern ideas about, for example, valve timing in four strokes, valve train stiffness in the case of push rods and rocker arms, and get excellent results.
Yeah, this bike gave excellent results. The top end had been rebuilt. He dropped a valve after, I think, 5 years. He was at New Jersey and he dropped a valve. So he said, "Hey, you're getting a fresh top end." He sent the cylinders to Millennium Technologies, and simultaneously, Gary Braun, who works at Millennium and does lots of great work there and was at the event, he had fixed some pipes for you. Simultaneously, Gary Braun sent me pictures of the cylinders at Millennium, and then so did Dan, and I got those crossed and in the ether to me, showing that it was happening.
Yeah.
After the test, the bike ran beautifully for the test. I didn't really get to hammer it, but I ran it through the gears and I, got it up to redline and all that. And that was essentially a break-in run for it. He went through and he did a leak down test, and he showed me the gauges, and it was 90-90, so 0% leak down. And he's very meticulous about, making sure that the valves are properly lapped and broken in and all that stuff. He has a very specific procedure he uses, because they are Nicosil bores. And so that was super. It was really, really something. Oh, but valve timing, that was the thing, is Dan listened to the podcast where we had talked about, the Udo Giedel bike, the 50-mile engines podcast, which you can go back in the past and you can listen to that. But he says, "Man, you would have saved me a lot of time if you'd done that, 5 years ago. You would have saved me years of development." Because he's developed the bike. When he got it, it was probably 62 horsepower, and through tuning work, he's increased it about 10 horsepower, roughly. Exhaust length, intake length, and then the cams, the valve train stiffness, chromoly push rods, and the cams are custom cams. They're asymmetrical, and they are, as described, NASCAR cams. And then that is a lot of immediate lift, as much as you can stand, with fancy valve springs, in this case, nested dual valve springs, so that they don't get into a cyclic vibration and break. And so a lot of immediate lift, giving what you would call the Euro 5 torque curve. A lot of lift, not that much overlap. Yeah. And he says on the forums, the Euro guys who are racing, those cams will never work. And I'm here to tell you they work.
Yeah.
They definitely work. It's such a good running bike. The chassis was really nicely tuned too. There's the Cogent Dynamics had done the suspension, and it's beautifully tuned. It has cartridge dampers in the fork, which is what you were talking about. Technology that we can have today that we didn't have then. Adjustable cartridge dampers stuffed inside, which is a really nice thing to have. Let me tell you,
the front fork damping technology of that period was like a screen door closer. There's basically a check valve, so that most of the damping is on rebound, and it's a simple orifice. It's just oil going through a hole. And the same thing on compression, except that it's a bigger hole, so there's less upward shock to the chassis. And the check valve is open on compression and closes for rebound, so that it goes down easily and comes up slowly. And that's all you could do. You could, we got to put some 50 weight in here. This thing's moving too freely. That was the kind of crudity that we were up to in that time.
Well, yeah, I mean, your orifice damping, you can, if you make the hole small enough that the oil is flowing through, so that your low shaft speeds are controlled, so that you don't get wallow in the corner, you don't get this kind of cycling. If you make it that small, as soon as you hit a bump, the orifice essentially turns to nothing, because it's a square, right? It goes
V squared, yeah.
V squared. So the friction goes up as a square, and the hole sort of, at a high enough shaft speed, the hole essentially ceases to exist for the oil.
And this is why everybody used to upshift out of turn 5 just as they hit the west banking at Daytona, because otherwise it would just be a hammer blow to the chassis, and you probably lose the back end and have to spend several tenths of a second getting gathered up
Yeah.
so as to proceed. So great things can be done with suspension damping, but there's still the problem of chatter. And when Todd Henning was struggling with his vintage Honda four-strokes, he finally overcame the chatter, but he had all those things available to him, cartridge dampers and whatnot, and he just persistently worked at it until he crushed the chatter to nothing.
It was something I was proud of during the race weekend, was getting on. My goal as ever, getting on an unfamiliar bike, unfamiliar track. We're trying to make incremental progress, not excremental progress. So you just keep going, adding, braking later and trying to turn the throttle sooner, maximizing your line, getting all of that stuff sorted out so that you're doing an efficient and safe lap. And you're riding versus the track. Like during practice, the other bodies on the track are certainly relevant, and you can probably learn things from looking at them. But ultimately, it should be you and the cornering line and how the bike is operating. And so I was feeling good. We're getting times. I got into, low 50s, got into 50 flats, stuff like that. And then finally got into the 49s. And going on to the front straightaway, I got chatter during practice. And I knew, why was that? It was terrifying because it felt like it went on for 1,000 feet. And it was the first time the bike had done anything to say, like, hey, wait a minute. And it was just a front end load, not on the throttle enough going down the hill to get that drive onto the front straight. And it chattered. And I was terrified again, because I thought it went on for 1,000 feet. I'm like, what is that? Screamed into my helmet. I'm sure I had a microphone, so I'm sure that's been recorded. We'll put that in the video. And but what was satisfying was I loaded the bike enough to get something, to get a protest, and that meant I was using the bike's available performance, and I felt proud of doing that. And it was borne out in the lap times, and I did get chatter during the race, having to load it, racing with the two guys I was talking about earlier, because it was, as they say, the hammer and tong battle. It was really fun, just so satisfying with those guys. They were so cool, and it was great.
In olden times, when hot young riders would encounter chatter for the first time, they would try to ride through it. But as Mick Grant put it years ago, he said, chatter occurs under conditions of heavy load and good grip. So trying to add more power to ride through it just makes it more, it intensifies the action. So you quickly find out, well, that's not the answer.
Yeah, there was, we used a Continental 3CR, they're a Road Attack 3CR. They're a vintage race tire. So you have a great compound and skinny enough to fit the rims. And there was enough grip. In fact, I never worried about grip. Even we put them on warmers, but on like just a warm setting, like call it 100 degrees. They don't actually want to be on warmers. They don't want to be 180 degrees like you might have a Pirelli slick or something, or any other slick. You just want them to be not cold. I want them to be not cold. Let's put it that way. And so does the bike's owner. And just went out and just rode around, but there was enough grip to get chatter. And that load for me was off throttle, turning, getting down to the apex so that I could pull the trigger.
And you were transferring weight to the front then.
Transferring, trailing. And then if I did that a little too long, it was crack the throttle, and it would go away. So we just altered our style a little bit there. But there were times where I had to go out because I had a bike, coming at this angle and I'm coming at this angle, and we had to make sure that our paths, we didn't occupy the same space.
There were a number of distinguished people at Barber, several of them speaking. Alan Cathcart, for one. David Aldana, with that cocky grin of his, which does not diminish with age, and Neil
Oh,
Spalding,
Spalding. Yep.
the author of MotoGP Technology, 3 editions, and Cook Nelson, who
Cook.
was the man who was put in charge of Cycle Magazine to put the Floyd Clymer era behind it. Floyd Clymer, some of you of my vintage will recall, was famous for riding a Harley Davidson while seated backward on it. I believe there were also hints of mail fraud and other difficulties. And reviews of motorcycles said that the new bike, as always before, was ideal for general riding, family fun, and racing. So everything was perfect. And so that was the climate in which Cycle and Cycle World introduced actual criticism. And by this, I don't mean saying that's a bad motorcycle, but here are the characteristics of that motorcycle. You might want to know what they are if you're considering purchase. So that was during the time that we were in print. That was the major focus of interest in the book, was road tests of recent late model machines, because people wanted that solid information. They wanted to see a dyno curve that wasn't somebody from marketing doing freehand exercises in the air.
No, it was an explosion of popularity of of Cycle World. Meeting Joe Parkhurst when I did back in the day, it was he's describing the era, and he says we just explained it like it was, and also we were willing and wanted to test Japanese motorcycles, and there were other publications that weren't so inclined to do that. They were sort of circling the wagons against the interlopers, and it's like, no, these are good products that deserve to be fairly reviewed, and to tell people plainly. That's the thing that was, with Joe's magazine, it wasn't a hatchet job. It wasn't just trying to flame the thing to the ground. It was, no, these are the specific qualities that are successful about this motorcycle, and here are the issues that we had, and they're stated plainly, and you're, I think the goal remains for me in running the website is, what we want is, I want a road test. I want to write a road test to where the engineering team and development team read that road test and say, yep, you nailed it. You got us. Yeah, we couldn't get rid of that, or whatever, whatever those things are. You want to do that job. You want to be
taken seriously. Yes.
Taken seriously and worthy of a proper critique of a motorcycle, so that someone who's going to spend their money on it is getting what they know they want to get.
If you plan to go to the Barber Museum one day, just like the U.S. Air Force Museum near Dayton, Ohio, it is not a one-day affair. You will feel rushed if you're there for one day. You'll be saying to yourself, well, I'm going to have to come back now and see all this other stuff, because there is a lot of other stuff. And if you care about motorbikes, there's a lot to see, and more than you can see in a day. I spoke with George Barber some years ago about how he happened to do this. He said, when I was a young fellow, I was naturally interested in hot cars. I drove a Porsche or two. And he said, when I inherited the milk business, I knew we had a well-equipped shop, because we did the maintenance on all of our milk delivery vehicles. They could restore automobiles. So I thought, why don't we restore a couple? So we did that. And he said, I was sort of disappointed, because having gone through the whole thing, I knew what the engine was, what the rear end was, what all the parts were. but nobody in the public could see them. All the lids and doors and hatches were shut. So that made me think of motorcycles, because with the motorcycle, what is there, you can see it all. So that was the direction we went, and are still going.
Yeah, the motorcycle collection is crazy, but he's also got a bunch of spectacular cars, and he seems to have a real thing for the Lotus mark. Lotuses
Yes,
are,
no question about it.
I mean, tube chassis, and my favorite Lotus would be a 23, the 23B. It's just a little pancake tube frame with a potato chip, fiberglass body, and something probably at least I would expect the vintage racers to be sort of near 200 horsepower or something like that out of that motor. And he's got them just peppered all over the place. He's got Formula One cars. They're hanging from ceilings. They're stuck up on the walls. They're just everywhere.
There's one on top of the elevator.
Yep.
As it rises to your floor, you're looking and you think, there's a car there.
Yeah.
A Formula One car. What's that? So there's whimsy.
The touches everywhere. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, walking up the stairs in the paddock, there are connecting rods sunk into the concrete of the stairs. It's just there's sculpture everywhere, little things everywhere you go, reminding you of where you are and what we're celebrating.
Sure.
And I can't recommend going to the Vintage Fest enough. But you can go to the museum anytime. Anytime you get yourself down to Birmingham, Leeds area, it's open most days of the year. It's open. You should, as you said, take a couple days.
He says that the museum the track is in use over 300 days of the year. So this is not a pure exercise of turning money into fun. There's also a self-sustaining aspect. There's a Porsche driving experience that's based there. There's quite a lot of industry use of the track, and I'm told that the museum is funded far into the future. So if you can't make it this year, it'll still be there when you do make it.
Yeah.
But of course, yes.
Oh, we had one of those days. I was there for racing. We finished on Sunday. The ARMA program was ultra seamless, really well done. A little sketchy, I have to say. I was in the first race, and all you get is a sighting lap. They call it a warm-up lap, but at 8:00 in the morning, I had to go race, and you go out, you do a lap. There's shaded areas of the track. It's misty overnight. And that's really on your mind. As soon as the green flag drops and you're going into turn one, you're like, turn two is kind of shady. I wonder what's going to happen up there.
Yes.
But there was that. And anyway, the program was really slick. The announcing was really good. You knew when you had to be out for your race. So we finished up on time. And then the next day, Monday, was a Nate Kern. They call it Nate Kern's a racer. He races hooligan and other things, a longtime racer. And he had the Nate Kern Double R Fest, they call it. And so it's a BMW track day, BMW M1000RR, S1000RR. You can bring anything. They're welcoming to all brands and marks and people. But that's a rental day. It's a rental day after the races. And there I was riding an M1000RR, and that was part of the video. Was I'm riding a replica of the very first BMW Superbike, and also the latest version. And interesting how far we've come. That
Yes.
M1000, we dyno those somewhere around 190 rear wheel on a DynoJet dyno, and the bike I had been riding that weekend at the facility was dynoed at 70 horsepower. That's what we got with the ambient air and all that. So I went from 70 to about 190 horsepower, full suite of electronics, aerodynamics, quick shifter, light throttle. And that was what was one of the most interesting things about that, was that the Superbike, the M1000RR, was both easier and infinitely harder to ride. It was easier because the throttle was very light. It had traction control. So I could put a lot of throttle in at an apex and I could feel it working. And as you're picking the bike up, it's adding power as required.
Yes.
By available grip. And you're just picking the line and going. And then it was pulling impossibly hard. So a lot more fatiguing because the loads are just incredibly higher, even with the, I'm using a DOT race tire, essentially. And the loads are a lot higher, but the effort to turn the throttle, it has an up and down quick shifter, seamless, like going into a corner, just tap, tap, and away you went. It was great. Exiting corners, ba, 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 that beautiful seamless upshift, and then braking. I had twin Gramica discs, cast iron discs on this vintage BMW, and it stopped really well. And it had a predictable, not scary amount of flex going on. You could feel the front end kind of loading up. You could trail brake it quite hard, and it was pretty nice. But you're working that lever. It takes a lot of effort to do that, and then turning the bike. Trail braking was a lot of effort. And on the M, I was floating the back tire going into Charlotte's, which you have a pretty good straightaway with a downhill braking area, lifting the back tire and a lot of load on the old shoulders and squeezing the tank, trying not to go over the windshield as a human projectile.
Yes.
But the lever effort to do that was really low, and the ability to modulate that, because the first time I floated the rear, it was a surprise. I was getting used to a completely different motorcycle. What was great about the relatability was the track positioning was really essentially quite similar. It was far more critical to have the M1000RR aimed in the direction you wanted it to go very precisely when it was time to hit the throttle. Yeah. There was a lot more latitude with a 70 horsepower bike. You could sort of yeah, I'm pretty good. And you could just hit it over a blind crest, because there really are 3 significant blind corners on that track that if you can pick your markers and be set up properly for, you can just make yards on people who are not doing that. And you try to get those corners right. But anyway, it was a rented day. It was a track day afterward, and that was part of our story, is sort of 50 years separating these bikes, and what have we witnessed and how do we experience it.
The nature of the power or the torque curve that a motorcycle tire can tolerate is very different from that of a race car, because the race car has acres of footprint and it uses the whole width of each tire tread. Whereas a motorcycle, since it cambers, leans over for turns, you're only using roughly 1/3 of the tread width at any given moment. So your connection to Mother Earth is weak.
Yeah. Well,
and in order to transmit, imagine transmitting 300 horsepower from a MotoGP engine through a single tire. It calls for optimism. But the thing that BMW learned when they went superbike racing first, Troy Corser would go to the front after the start and then start moving backwards, because the motorcycle was gradually lunching on its tires. And finally, he might finish 13th. And this was caused by BMW's great, profound experience of Formula One. And you have to change your thinking and make a torque curve that is more predictable, flatter, and easier to use, easier even for electronics to smooth. Because as former Ducati engineer Corrado Cecchinelli said about, back in the 90s, he said, the smoother the natural engine is, the easier it is for the electronics to make a good job of the torque curve. So that's why when Formula One constructors like Cosworth designed the Aprilia Cube 3-cylinder engine, it was tremendously fast in a straight line, but its only possible purpose in real life was burnouts because it could not get around the racetrack. Ilmore built an 800cc V4, and it didn't go anywhere. Now, if electronics are the whole story, why couldn't they just load the electronics on, punch the button, and set lap records? The torque curve is also built into the cam timing and every other variable in the engine. So it requires a complete rethink. If you're doing an engine for a motorcycle, you can't do the things that you can do when you have 4 great big tires.
It's so true. I was fortunate to get a ride in a BMW M3 competition. So it's an M3 with the competition packages, 503 horsepower, great big tires. They had, it's the performance driving school that they were cars from that school here at the track, and they were doing things related to being on display, and they had 2 of their instructors, and they were giving rides to folks who were attending that track day. And so I got 2 laps in that car. And there are a couple of things, on a motorcycle, you're dynamic and you're part of what the motorcycle is doing, and you're leaning with the motorcycle, you're hanging way off in a corner, you're accelerating, you're tucked in, and you're leaning forward. And it's athletic in the sense that you're, just as if you're trying to lunge off the line on a football field, you don't do that standing up, you don't do that sitting in a chair, you're leaned over and you're ready to go, the sporting position of a motorcycle. And so the tremendous acceleration or the braking, you're dynamically reacting to, interfaced with the motorcycle. But you get in a car, and I was just a passenger, you get in a car and you're sitting in a chair. And so the side loads the side loads are crazy. They feel unnatural because I've spent my whole career riding motorcycles. It feels unnatural. It does feel incredibly fast. And this guy driving was a talented driver. The car is rotating. But the one takeaway I have is exactly what you said, the loading of the tires. When we went to brake for Charlotte's Web, when I'm braking for Charlotte's Web, I'm doing it swiftly, but I'm taking the brake lever and I am squeezing it. And I am lowering the front wheel on the springs, and I'm compressing the front tire to the maximum load that I feel comfortable, which in the straight line is lifting the back tire, and then and then give it a relax. And then trail braking, you're loading the front as much as you feel you should. And then you pause at the apex and you're looking up and you sight your exit, and then you roll in the throttle. In the car, braking was like the slamming of a door. He went bang. And I'm like, no way would I ever do that on a motorcycle. And it was just how it was. Bang. And then the car would rotate on brakes. The car would rotate, and then he'd hit the throttle, and we would carry this beautiful drift, and then peel, out to the curbing, get and then away, and every corner for hard braking, it was like a door slamming. And what felt to me like an instant load, it would be the load of death on a motorcycle. You would go, king, and the bars would go sideways, and off you'd go into the gravel. Very different experience. And I think at the apex too, the way that he came back into power was smooth, but far quicker than I would do at my skill level on a motorcycle. There may be people who peel in and give it more throttle or are rotating the bike. Jason Uribe was one of the coaches at the track day, so he was second in stock 1000, and obviously incredibly talented, super swift. And I'd love to sort of be the fly on the wall on that motorcycle to see what his inputs are and what I could learn from something like that. It was gratifying to follow him around on the M1000 RR and find that most of my essential track positions that I had learned from the R75, trying to set a lap time and be safe and have the bike aimed, were really similar. There were a few refinements, and obviously something slightly different with a a superbike tire and superbike power, but I was gratified to say, like, hey, I'm pretty close here. There's places definitely where I got to make up time. If I ever race there again, I'm going to study.
Yes, study.
Study.
I got a ride. I was at Willow Springs in California, and it was a a day when John Ulrich was going to ride Kenny's Daytona Square 4. So this is early 80s. And could see that John was nervous. And finally went up to Bud Axlin, who was there looking after the bike, and he said, this motorcycle, is it really as rip roaring as they say? Bud turned to him and said mildly, "It'll do a wheelie." And, and at some point, Eddie Lawson arrived in a new Porsche that he'd bought, something fancy. I don't know what it was. And sometime during the afternoon, when nothing was going on, he said, "Get in, I'll give you a ride in my new car." Off we went around the track. And as we rushed through the first turn, and I'm sort of trying to brace myself as best I can, he said, "Seatbelt on your side doesn't work. So sorry about that." So it was great fun.
Come on now. Jeez.
Oh, warranty work needed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it'll do a wheelie. I think nerves are, if you're not nervous, you should think about doing something else. If you're not nervous getting out on a racetrack, you should have some degree, I think you should have, I think a little bit of nervousness shows that you respect what's happening. Don't you? I think.
Well, I think that it's the reason that it exists is to prepare you for action.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you could just blandly go out and crash.
Yeah.
I think that you're going to have to turn on that squirrel alertness and that frisson of anxiety and questioning and so forth is part of that switching on process. Fear. Jorge Lorenzo talked about fear quite often and acknowledged that it exists. These are not men of steel with nerves of iron, or possibly the reverse. They're human beings with extraordinary skills who are not that different from us in terms of emotions. And we're seeing this now with Jorge Martin, who is currently on a Ducati. Next year he'll be on an Aprilia, and making the rounds is that frightening video of him with not just his elbow, but his whole upper arm right to his shoulder on the pavement. And you can see his leathers being deflected from the contact, and it's done in slow motion, rounding a corner. And what he's trying to do is emulate the La Bestia, who is so noted for having tire left at the end of the day. He rides with extreme body offset to the inside. What he's doing is pushing the motorcycle upright to get it on the part of the tread that is closely supported by the carcass. It's not that cantilevered out edge. Edge grip has been called a wasting asset. And if you use it too often, there won't be any left when you need it in those final laps. But Martin has a problem with performance anxiety, and he's very candid about it. He's done all sorts of things to try to train himself out of the worst of it and out of its ability to compromise his performance. but I think that it's marvelous that human beings like ourselves, filled with anxiety and confidence in equal measures, can just straighten up, go out on the racetrack, and perform so beautifully, so wonderfully. And I think
It
that
is.
is encouraging for the rest of us, that we can manage. Am I going to have to file my tax return late? And what will my wife say when she finds out I haven't cleaned the leaves out of the gutters? And all the annoying little anxieties of daily life. It's not the Motegi circuit, but it's real.
Yeah. Coping
So
with that. Yeah, you have to cope with that precariousness that a motorcycle represents because you're trying to go faster. It's such a huge difference between a track day and then waiting for the green flag to drop.
yeah,
Huge. I have a certain amount of nerves going out for a track day, but the nerves at a racetrack, you have them. I try to think rationally. I go up to the starting line, I breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth, and I watch everything that's happening, and I try to keep my thoughts organized. And then when the light goes, I'm not frantically throwing the clutch and revving to the moon. I'm just doing another start. And you try to, really, for me, it's always been maintaining a level of intellectualism, even under the greatest, when things are going very wrong, like, oh no, I've left my braking too late. How do I deal with this
recoup. Yes,
in a rational way that has a hopefully positive outcome? And that's been it for me anyway. Well, I hope he figures out how to keep coping with that, because it's certainly beautiful to watch him successfully negotiate
yes,
a racetrack. Oh my
certainly
gosh.
is. And Benyaya, who is a two-time champion now, and he's only around 10 points behind Martin. And the photographs of him, his hair is as the helmet left it, and he has a kind of goofy look on his face, like, hey, I just came through the ceiling. And then he talks and he says well-considered things. You can tell that, for example, in a recent race, he said, the front was gone. I had to base my style on the rear. And when it was gone, I had to change my lines. He's got a backup for every problem. And Kenny Roberts once said, my reflexes aren't all that quick, so I have to get a lot of my thinking done ahead of time. I think of my mind as being a big Velcro board, and sticking to that board are little packets. Each one contains my plan to deal with a specific set of circumstances. When those circumstances pop up, I grab the packet and do it. So we see people do miraculous things, but they have a method. They are not, as somebody once put it, just that good. People learn how to do this. Well, we can leave out certain persons, but in general, people learn how to do this and they work at it. They are thoughtful. They try to find out what they're doing wrong. For example, when Mike Baldwin was starting out in club racing, and famed vintage racer Dave Roper was always ahead of him, and when he tried to follow Roper, he would just crash. He would lose the front and slide off the track, and it was humiliating. So he went home and he got the bathroom scale from the upstairs bathroom and the one from the downstairs bathroom, put the bike on the scale, and then he got on the bike and studied how the weight shift is affected by your position on the bike. And with that information, he went out and beat those guys because he was able to load the front, make it grip, and apply his other abilities to race winning effect. And he always talked about there's no such thing as a natural.
Well, Dave Roper's still racing today. He was racing Arma with me this past weekend.
Yeah, you bet.
How super was that? Well, we've wandered far afield, and I just brought it back with Dave Roper. Thanks for saying that. We've wandered far off of Barber and Kenny Roberts, and but as it is, it is an event that kind of encompasses the entire motorcycle culture. It's spectacular. It was fun to share it with you, Kevin. It was great to see guys like Cook Nelson and Kenny Roberts and all those folks in one place. And to every fan who brought something interesting, the ring road around the track was packed with citizen motorcycles that were just infinitely interesting and weird and wonderful and new and old. And it was just spectacular.
An opportunity to spend a weekend with like-minded persons. People who don't think you're stupid for riding a motorcycle.
Yep.
People who don't think you're an unbalanced person. Riding a motorcycle is normal in that crowd.
We show exception. We show exceptional balance, Kevin. Next year is the 20th Barber Vintage Festival, so join us then. I should hope to be racing once again, perhaps on a bike of my own construction. We'll see. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you listening. We appreciate all the fans at the event and everywhere else who say, "Hey, I recognize you because you're flannel, Hoyer." Luckily, I'm not wearing a flannel today.
Yep.
In any case, thanks so much for listening. We'll see you down in the comments. We appreciate those a ton, and we will catch you next time.